are. I will pass over to my friend who will take over from you. So over to you.
Thanks, Ashish. Appreciate it. So again, this is Rick Truesdale. Just wanted to spend some time speaking with you about kind of the legacy transformation space that Infosys has a center of excellence in. One of the things that people don't realize is that even though we've been in this space dating back to the early 80s, and we've been involved in many transformational journeys that organizations have looked towards, we now have a kind of a center of excellence that's really focused in this space, especially given kind of the transformation journey and time that we're in currently, many organizations. So what you'll see here is kind of a semblance of what's happening across the industry and across many organizations, where not only is it becoming kind of a cost savings conversation, which it has been for the past 10, 15 plus years, but now it's becoming, okay, yes, we've kind of embraced clouds, we've embraced microservices, we're embracing all of these newer technologies that once upon a time, long-standing organizations that have relied heavily on legacy systems have kind of shied away from. It was a great conversation, but they've shied away from it. Now, because these are becoming more mainstay, they're becoming more commonplace in agile, newer organizations that are kind of taking mainstream by storm, and the fact that we're having resource challenges with people retiring. You're not seeing a lot of people taking COBOL program classes within universities. They're there, but it's just not kind of the new thing, if you will, because resources like that are becoming more expensive to find and harder to find. So that being the case, and other soft pain points are just agility. So these organizations over 20, 30 plus years have kind of cornered themselves into traditional waterfall methodologies, cornered themselves in the technologies that are behind them. They're not as agile as they once were. And once upon a time, agile wasn't quite as important, but again, newer organizations that are more technology leading are outpacing them. So lack of agility, lack of being able to find resources that are in a timely fashion, the cost component definitely factors into that piece as well. A lot of these pressures are really coming to bear, and where it used to be kind of a small conversation around, I want to save costs and move stuff off the mainframe here and there, now it's becoming, you know what, we need to transform, and we need to find somebody that can help us get there. So these are really key pain points that are really driving a lot of the conversations we're having today, and I think that Infosys is kind of well positioned to take this, given the expertise that we bring to the table. Greg? So I've kind of already touched on this to some manner or another, but again, business growth, agility, cost optimizations, smooth operations, all of these kind of come into play. The one piece I didn't really touch on that's kind of highlighted here, and that is customer experience. I don't know about you, but how often do you go into hardware? So I'll try to keep from mentioning customer names specifically, but there's a lot of organizations or retail markets you go into where I see a green screen. And from a retailer's perspective, them being the ones kind of driving that transaction, if you will, maybe that's one thing. But when that starts leaking over into the customer experience, when that leaks over into the user experience of who's trying to consume and buy your goods, green screens, legacy systems, user experience, customer experience becomes ever more paramount. And I think that's also a big driver behind these kinds of conversations. Next. And so, all of this stuff kind of comes into play, which adds to the complexity. So I don't know how often times I've talked to CXOs where they've told me, Rick, I agree with everything you're saying, but I'm scared to death of disrupting, the systems that kind of are the backbone of what we do, what brings value to our organizations. I can't afford any downtime. I can't afford any disruptions in what's going on. And you look at this kind of cross-section of what a technology landscape could potentially look like, what comes into play. It's a highly complex scenario. Okay, you can't necessarily go to boutique firms. You can't necessarily go to someone that's really good in one particular thing. You really need somebody that has a wide depth and breadth of experience across all of these pieces, as well as having that expertise to help you with that transition, as well as how, and this doesn't really show it that well, but also how does that cross how does that also mitigate ongoing projects that are going on today? It's not like everything stands still for 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, multiple years, depending on how wide and broad and complex this is. How can you help me go through this transformation to whatever that looks like without disrupting other things that are going on? So there's also kind of program management. There's other things that come into play to kind of engage and help through this journey. Great. So what does that mean? So what that means is, where once upon a time it was a tactical conversation. Infosys, all the SIs out there are very good at tactical stuff, right? TIA basically has it all figured out. They've gone through their strategy, their execution, their, where are the KPIs for the year, what's the CXO telling Wall Street. All those things kind of come into play. They know they've got to do this. They put prioritization around it. They bring a lot of, key SMEs and executives together to put some structure around it and a program around it. And then they say, okay, Infosys, we need you to now execute against these line items that kind of play into the downstream part of the journey. Well, that was okay at once upon a time, and in some cases it's okay if you do have that figured out. But the reality is when you start talking about the transformation journey as it relates to legacy systems and when I say legacy, it's not just a mainframe. A legacy can be AS400. It can mean other platforms that are not where the bleeding edge market is that you're competing against. It's other things as well. So that's when other things come into mix, such as program management, centers of excellence. When you start talking about, decommissioning those platforms, when you start looking at, what are some of the enterprise kind of relevant architectures you need to go against. What does the landscape look like? What are the technical components? What does Agile look like? What is the roadmap to modernization? What are some of the industry-specific things that make sense? So when Ashish talks about, having kind of industry expertise, that also is very key. What are your competitors doing in your respective vertical, not necessarily across all verticals. So I think all of these things from advisory services all the way through to how you want to execute against that and implementation are very key in this whole journey that you go through. Next. So I did want to touch on one of the elements here, which is kind of the Infosys consulting kind of strategy side of the conversation, because that's one area that a lot of people just don't think of SIs or Infosys as really kind of carrying that particular component. So we've got a lot of people in our Infosys consulting organization that kind of bring that kind of strategic part of the conversation to mix. They're the ones, along in conjunction with my team, where we partner up, where you engage with what is the business trying to do? What is the business as is today? And what is your application and data landscape look like? How does it relate to what your go-to-market objectives are? They also bring in industry vertical expertise as well, so that you know what the competition is doing, you know where the lessons learned are that we've kind of benefited from through these conversations. And that becomes a big critical part as to how you start the conversation. So usually what I do is when I get into, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here a little bit, but when I have conversations with the likes of TIA, I basically find out where are you on, number one, is this something that's being discussed with amongst your organization? Is legacy transformation, is IT transformation, is technology transformation, of importance to what you're looking at today? And if it is, let's talk about where you are on that journey. Are you at the front end of that journey? Are you halfway through it? Are you at the tactical end of it? And where does that start? That's a big part. And then, so the strategic part of that conversation is critical. I think everything is kind of a top-down centered conversation to be had, and that's where we want to try to engage ideally. And I say that only because I've had conversations with organizations where they've told me, Rick, come back to me when we're ready to start executing against the strategy that we're working on right now. And what I try to impress upon them is that, we've done these hundreds of times. We've been doing this since back in the early 80s. And you can do that, but there's a good chance what you put in front of us to execute against is going to miss a lot of things that we've seen before, and we've already figured out ways around it. So ideally, I don't want to be there. I want to be in the front of that conversation. I mean, we'll do it, but you're just creating more risk than necessary. So that's where the strategic part of the conversation comes in. Great. So I kind of touched on this earlier already, but if you look at, where you are in that journey, this is what I was talking about. So we've got organizations where I was speaking with an automotive kind of retailing manufacturer in Florida. It's been in the business for 30-plus years. They're a legacy organization. They're realizing they're falling behind the competition. They're not as competitive as they used to be because of their inagility of their legacy systems. And so I was talking with them about all of this formulaic stuff that we do to help them through that journey. They're like, Rick, you're right. We're going to need some help. So in their particular case, they were at the front end of this kind of journey where organizationally they're thinking about it and they need help on how to move from one step to the next. There's other organizations where they're very siloed from across lines of business. They tend to work autonomously with some direction from CXO leadership, but autonomous. So in those cases, we look at engaging from a line of business perspective where you still think of it as an organizational entity, but, where do you want to start? And that could still be a business conversation. It can still be a prioritization conversation of where you want to go. That usually starts out with some sort of an apps rationalization kind of exercise where we look at the business, we look at the KPIs, we look at the priorities and where they want to go. We bring in industry best practices. We look at their landscape to figure out from an apps rationalization standpoint what's relevant, what maps and aligns with your current objectives, what doesn't, what should we consider retiring and getting rid of, what would make sense towards this technology by across the board, okay? And then, then you start working your way towards execution where you get into more traditional assessments with a disposition analysis and then execution against what that downstream may look like. And on the far right, this is just an example of some of the end goals that you've worked towards, whether it be rehosting, re-architecting, packaged applications, providing optimization around what you currently have, et cetera. So that's the journey that every organization goes through. I think traditionally people think of SIs, think of Infosys as being kind of at the far right of that formula. But the reality is we do all the time, and we need to be further or much more earlier engaged in that scenario. Greg? Again, I already spoke about what that early engagement looks like at the front end of that formula, which is kind of like a rationalization exercise. And every step through this process is always going to be a business component to it, which we don't want to lose sight of. What are the strategic alignment objectives we want to go for? What's the total cost of ownership and financial model? What does that transformation plan look like? It's all about planning and aligning with the business and where you're trying to go. And then in the center of that whole universe, as you come up with the as-is, what the business drivers are, you rationalize what makes sense to carry forward. You're almost kind of going through a house cleaning exercise. We were talking earlier about, building houses and moving. It's exactly what this is. Anytime you move from one house to another, you realize how often or little you use something and it gets tossed. So going through these transformation journeys has tons of benefits. One of those byproduct benefits is basically optimizing and carrying forward what makes sense and leaving behind what no longer is relevant, and maybe what could be holding you back as well. And then, of course, the program management governance component. And our strategic organization, our Infosys consulting organization, plays a heavy hand in this part of the formula. Great. So some examples of the Mass Mutual was one of the organizations that we did this full journey with, and we're still, frankly, involved in that. Depending on the size and scale of your organization can drive, how long this whole thing takes. Nothing happens in one big bang. So there, we're doing that kind of business, kind of strategic alignment with them, going through an apps rationalization across the board to see what makes sense, what doesn't, and where we want to carry it forward, which then moves into an assessment and then kind of a disposition analysis and execution plan to take you there. So we're on that journey with Mass Mutual. Another organization that I've also been intimately involved with is an organization called Securian, where we're doing exactly the same kind of thing, where it's starting at the beginning, and we're kind of midway through that process of execution in phase one, going through that. So that's ideally how it should happen. It makes everybody's life a lot easier. It mitigates risks. It costs less, and you get from point A to point B in a much more fluid fashion. Greg? As far as engaging kind of at a line of business perspective, that's where you are. Again, there's kind of a hybrid model between organizational kind of line of business as far as what that looks like. If there's one large bank, I won't mention their names. I don't think I'm allowed to, but they're a 750,000 MIPS organization from a mainframe perspective. That's just a part of their landscape. Their big CXO idea is they want to migrate and transform to the cloud over time. Obviously, that's going to take multi-years to get there. So they've already effectively got the strategic side of that equation figured out. They're kind of at the line of business point of execution where they're looking for help. So in that particular case, we would effectively do that discovery, assessment, and roadmap execution as per what their business strategy is kind of is driving us to do. In each case, including in this particular case, you still have kind of industry SMEs kind of engaged to kind of bring those lessons learned, bring what that industry is seeing from a trends perspective to give you best practices from an execution perspective. So very relevant as well. And then on the tactical side of that equation, as we've kind of discussed, there's a whole host of things that our Center of Excellence kind of brings to the table, and that involves whether it's just simply lifting and shifting, rehosting applications and systems as is. That makes sense and there's different weights and measures that come into play as to what the disposition analysis is. If you've got, as an example, if you've got applications that never see change, it keeps the lights on, is very relevant and core to our go-to-market solutions, but we rarely change it. Why re-architect it? Why rewrite it? Why reinvent the wheel when it's never changed, but it's still very foundational? Maybe that makes sense to rehost it to a lower-cost platform. If it is something that does see a lot of change, it is something that needs to be more agile and reactive to market changes, maybe re-architecting and going to like a microservices cloud-based scenario makes the most sense. Or maybe there's packaged applications out there that provide the same value. Our competition is doing more of that, so maybe a package system makes the most sense. The point being, all those things we've talked about up to this point are levers and drivers towards what the end state needs to look like and how we want to get ahead of where you want to be. So, accelerate, renew, transform, it blends all the way from optimizing MIPS usage on the mainframe, which is about, making the most usage of your capacity today and optimizing it, rehosting it, re-architecting it, rewriting it, doing APIification where you can kind of black box stuff and just write APIs into it, packaged application. I mean, the options are pretty endless in this particular case. Great. So again, I've kind of leveraged some scenarios. Another key thing that probably I didn't call that in here, but is rules extraction. So one of the things that's becoming extremely interesting in the market today is this whole idea of rules extraction. And what that means is there's a lot of stuff out there where you just don't know what you don't know. You don't have properly documented systems. And I do want to rewrite my system, so maybe I want to extract the rules and use those rules to re-architect to something else. There's a brokerage or organization out in Minneapolis that has a portfolio system that's responsible for $60 billion worth of business. And it's all on the legacy system. It's all being driven by developers who are all on the cusp of retiring out. Back to my earlier pain point. So all these people are on the verge of retiring. The organization is kind of freaking out, for lack of a better term, on what are they going to do when their developers start weaning away. So in their particular cases, we desperately need to rewrite, re-architect this stuff anyway. Let's extract the intellectual property out of what we currently have, rules extraction, and then let's take that to then rewrite everything over to Java, which we're in the throes of doing today. So rules extraction is becoming huge. Also, in the automotive insurance business, rules extraction is becoming critical. And what almost all of them are doing that I've been exposed to, they're, because of self-driving cars, because the market's changing, they're almost having to rethink how they go to market and how they execute against that. So what they're doing is they're taking all of their intellectual property, extracting the rules, putting it into a rules engine. The data is being put into data warehouses. They're wrapping an API layer around it for all their end users to go into after that data. So that's happening across at least 3 of the automotive insurance companies that are out there. They're all doing effectively the same thing.
Or are you guys going in and putting in? Or?
We are, in
Okay.
in varying different ways, because each one of those are kind of going after different rules engines. So the output of a rules extraction has to look a little differently,
Okay.
and then
So
how
it's unique.
it is
Or
slightly
customized?
unique.
Yeah.
So, and honestly, that's where frankly, the brilliance of, some of the guys that we have onshore and offshore around systems development and what have you, is that even though you've got a functional capability of automating and bringing tools and accelerators to extract rules, there's always going to be some level of customization on the output, so that we can go to the right rules engine, we can do the right things, and bring efficiencies to that exercise. And they're just brilliant at being able to create widgets and different types of custom code around what needs to be done for that situation. So rules extraction is becoming critical. How we go through the assessment process and analysis and disposition downstream plays is becoming critical, and then the downstream end results also becoming really critical, and having expertise around that is very big. So those are probably kind of the big points. So if there's one message I wanted to leave people with in this conversation, is that Infosys, number one, has a center of excellence around doing legacy transformation. Number two, there's a lot more to that conversation than just simply tactically going after downstream things that are being asked to do. And I think it's critical for organizations to engage people like ourselves earlier in that conversation, so we can bring lessons learned into it. We can bring tools and accelerators that can help mitigate risks. We can bring proper program management into the conversation so that we can alleviate impacts across other projects while you're going through it, and helping with change management as you go through these changes. So those are really the critical elements. And just love to talk to you guys more about this. Even though this is a high-level overview of what we do, there's certainly nuances we can bring to each conversation and need that are out there. Over to you, Rick.
Thanks, Rick. And like Rick said, if you want to continue the conversation, any questions or further conversation, Rick is local in Charlotte, so we can get him up here and get some more meetings on the books if there's any